Hi, I'm John Robinette, one of your hosts for Marks Chat. In light of the Association of Art Museum Directors' recent resolution regarding financial flexibility for their member institutions during this pandemic crisis, Marks Chat decided to investigate a little bit further what the implications are for both the ethics involved and also for the field. So Amanda Robinson and I decided to check in with various experts to explore what exactly those implications are. First, we'd like to welcome Sally Yerkovich. She is the chair of the ICOM Ethics Committee. She also wrote the book, A Practical Guide to Museum Ethics. She's a professor of ethical issues in museums at Columbia University, and she was also the chair of the AAM Direct Care Task Force, which was responsible for the most recent revision of their direct care guidelines. Thanks for joining us, Sally. Of course, we're here to talk about the recent resolution by AAMD on the financial flexibility in museums. So as someone who's dealing with ethics in museums directly and has a long history in it, I want to get your take on the statement, because it does seem to represent a shift in ethics on their behalf, of course, in very trying and unprecedented times. So, what is your first take on the statement?
Well, the statement has several different parts to it. The first part really deals with restrictions on endowment funds or specific funds that museums have, and that really, those restrictions really have no ethical implications. There could be some legal issues there, but basically those are separate from the major issue for ethics, which is the use of funds realized from the sale of deaccessioned objects. The change that AAMD made, and they acknowledge this, makes their code of ethics essentially the same as what other associations have at the moment. The American Alliance of Museums, the International Council of Museums, the American Association of State and Local History, all allow for funds from deaccessioned objects to be used either for acquisitions or for the direct care of objects, or direct care of collections. So in that respect, AAMD is just aligning their ethical code, their standards, with other professional organizations.
I see. So in that respect, and well, have those other codes been in place for quite a while like that? Or are they kind of one by one coming into this realization? AAM's code has been in effect since the early 1990s. And I think that the other codes have followed suit. They've been in place in the same way. I'm not sure about ICOM. I know that the 2004 ICOM code has allowed for the use of funds for collections care. ASLH has had their standards aligned with AAM since the 90s as well. Yeah. So you're actually making it sound like AAMD has been holding out on this for a while. Do you know that there would be real reason for that?
Well, AAMD has taken a much harder line than the other organizations historically. In part, it's because the art museums' collections are in many respects different from the other kinds of museums' collections. They're much more valuable, and they're focused on a single, usually on a single, well, not a single genre, because they have sculpture and other things as well as paintings, but still they're focused. They're much more focused than collections in some other kinds of museums. And the guidelines, especially for AAM and ICOM, are guidelines that apply to a variety of kinds of museums. So in some senses, they are attuned to the needs of a wide range of institutions, whereas AAM is much more focused. So I think their code of ethics is their code of ethics represents a code that's suitable for the kind of museums that they represent.
I see. So you don't see it as something that may have broader, say, ongoing implications. Perhaps maybe they adopt something to this effect that's more permanent as opposed to just the 2 years.
That's always a possibility. It's the care of collections is a really important aspect of what museums do, and when AAM tried to institute a very strict code of ethics, saying that museums could only use funds from deaccessioning to acquire new objects, there was a lot of pushback from history museums, natural history museums that had a wider range of objects, and in some cases, as usually in the case of history museums that weren't actively buying new things, but were instead accepting donations and then needing to ensure that they had the funds to take care of their collections. So the pressure from the other kinds of the sort of non-art museums made AAM realize that they needed to have a much more flexible standard for deaccessioning.
I see.
And so that's how the broader, if you want to call it broader, that's how that stipulation, how direct care came into play.
Right. So regarding the ethical issue then of the idea of being able to deaccession and put forth 100% of those proceeds to direct care, and that much debated term direct care is so maybe it's not quite as much of an ethical issue as it seems to be, or quite as much of an ethical shift. Is that possible?
It could be possible. I mean, I think you have to, when something like this comes out, when a statement like this comes out, it's very easy to say, okay, this means if you need money to take care of your collections, you can sell things from your collection in order to get that money. And in fact, it's not quite like that. In fact, what AAM calls for is that if you want to use money for direct care of collections, you need to think about what that means for your institution, quite separate from any specific instance of selling something. So that you need to establish for your institution what direct care of collections means and put that in your collections policy. Then, when it comes to the point at which you're deaccessioning something, you have guidance about how you can use the funds from it. But it's not okay, now I can do this, let's go out and sell things kind of equation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and even that reality is very difficult, especially, in a time like now where, the market for selling things would either be bad or just difficult to find a buyer, potentially anyway, unless it's a private institution. Mm-hmm. So, it's definitely not as easy as it seems. But also the other part of their statement revolved around, using things for operating costs, which they permitted 5% to be used in sort of an endowment type of way. So you would actually, or accessing endowed funds as well, which I guess that is less of a, not, as you mentioned before, it's not really an ethical issue. It's just a sort of a legal issue that has to be sorted out internally. Right.
Right.
So, so how do you feel this will work? Do you think it'll have the intended results that they aspire to?
I would hope so. I think it's, we'll see how it works, but I would think that it will be, it will free up some museums to be able to take care of their collections at this point in time and, not be as concerned about them as they might have been otherwise.
Right. Now, we have the privilege of recording this conversation after we saw Mr. Brent Benjamin speak yesterday on the topic. He, of course, is the president of AAMD, and he, did a live Q&A about it. And he was very clear that not all of the AAMD members, there's 270 plus member museums, are actually on board with this topic. And I'm wondering what types of institutions might actually try to take advantage of this financial flexibility, as they call it.
It's difficult to say. As he mentioned yesterday, every museum is different. And so it's hard to know if there's a particular category of museums that would object to this. I think that, it's difficult to make a, blanket statement about it, but this issue has always been one that's been very controversial. And so it doesn't surprise me that there's a disagreement among the art museums about whether this is a good idea or not. There's always a fear that by opening the door and allowing for other uses of funds from deaccessioning, that you're at the top of a very slippery slope. And once the door is open, then you're going to be, start wanting to be able to use the funds for things that, like for expenses that may not be as appropriate. So I think that's part of the issue that people are thinking about right now.
Is there an ethical debate to be had about using funds to save a museum? And if the museum will have to say close because they don't have the funds to remain open, and deaccession in order to do that. So, saving jobs, saving an institution, and all of which is part of caring for a collection, and caring for objects. I mean, it feels like there's a discussion to be had there as well.
Yeah, there is. I think though that, usually this question comes to light at the point when institutions are in such bad shape that one of their only alternatives is to sell things from their collection to get money. AAM has started a dialogue about this, trying to make people aware of the fact that it's really earlier than that museums need to acknowledge their financial distress if they have it. And they need to be much more transparent with themselves, or they need to be more frank with themselves to admit that, gee, there may be a problem here and maybe we should do something about it before we get to the point of having the alternative be selling the collections or closing.
Right. So it's really a last-ditch effort if you're talking about deaccessioning to save a museum.
It usually is. And in a majority of the cases, I think it's not always been a successful effort because more needs to be done than just getting a quick infusion of cash from selling objects.
Right.
And
right.
also, very often when that happens, museums are selling some of their most valuable objects in order to be able to get a significant amount of money. And you have to ask the question then, are they really jeopardizing their ability to be an effective institution for the public by doing that?
Right.
So.
Do you see any other issues arising as a result of this statement, or could you also look at this statement and see it's not really that big deal? It's a lifeline to some institutions, and in 2 years we'll be back to how we were before. Maybe not 100%, but largely. What's a way to look at this, and what are your points of view?
I think it's a way to open the conversation about this for art museums. It's hard to imagine that art museums aren't having some of the same issues that other kinds of museums, like history museums, have been dealing with for a while. Many of them have very large collections, and many of them have difficulty in raising the money just to take care of the collection. So this may be, for some museums, something that they will want to continue to be able to do even after the 2-year time period is up. Maybe not, but I think that it opens up a conversation that's probably been bubbling under the surface for a while.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Right. I read something, I think it was this morning that I read, I wish I could remember where it was. Another distinguishing factor with art museums is that, unlike, say, a history museum, art museums are always acquiring. And that is really they don't live in they're not preserving a moment in time. And so deaccessioning has to be, on some level, a part of their program. And and there was talk about that yesterday, how, deaccessioning is just a part of existing. It's housekeeping to some degree.
Yeah. I think it's really important that we talk more about these issues and about how, deaccessioning is a regular part of a museum's operations. I thought that Brent and Benjamin made some really good points yesterday about the fact that sometimes a museum has 2 pieces of art by the same artist, both of which may be quite valuable. One is better than the other. Do they need both of them? Those are questions that art museums ask all the time, and they get raked over the coals sometime for selling the work by a famous artist. And the other side of the story isn't told, that they, in fact, have additional pieces by the same artist that are, in fact, of higher quality than the one that they're selling. And I think it's important for people to understand the kinds of decisions that we have to make when we're taking care of collections and thinking about using them for the benefit of the public.
Right. So in the end, maybe we don't look at it quite so much as putting it in the most sort of crass way of monetizing a collection by deaccessioning it, and that's certainly not what they're advocating here, because there are so many restrictions in place regarding this current resolution. But I think it was certainly taken that way, and maybe taken out of context that way. So maybe we can downplay slightly the ethical debate to be had there, that people are capitalizing on the collection. Would that be fair to say?
I'm sorry, the audio just broke up.
Oh yeah, no problem. I was just saying, do you think it's fair to say that we can downplay the ethical debate a little bit surrounding the monetization of a collection through deaccessioning in terms of this statement and this resolution?
I would hope so. I mean, I would hope that it would at least make us able to talk about some of these issues in not quite so contested an environment. One of the reasons that I wrote the book that I wrote was that I hoped that people would think about some of the ethical issues related to how museums operate in an absent a real crisis, and just get used to thinking about some of these ethical dilemmas or ethical points. Sorry.
That's funny.
No.
Now I have to credit him too.
Right.
That's fine. It's part of our life now. We all expect it. At any moment, my child will come in.
Right. So anyway, that we can talk about these things in a less heated environment, and grapple with some of the serious issues that we do face.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Anyway,
do you have any final thoughts or comments?
No, I think this is. I guess I'm pleased to see this in a way, in that I think it allows the museum field to think again about deaccessioning, about why we do it, and why it's necessary, and it allows us to talk more publicly about it, which I think is a healthy issue, and helps make what we do more transparent and perhaps even more interesting to the public.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks so much for your time, and we appreciate all of your insight into this issue, because I think a lot of people got very nervous at first when they read it. So, especially as collections care professionals, where we're like, oh my God, we're going to be what?
Right, exactly. No, I know. Well, deaccessioning is such a difficult process, or labor-intensive process, that I can certainly understand that.
Yeah. So, well, great. Thank you so much again. And we look forward to following what you do and all of your upcoming work.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone. Today, I'm joined by Mark Gold. He's a partner in the law firm of Smith, Green & Gold, LLP in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Mark holds a master's in museum studies from Harvard University, as well as degrees in economics and international studies from the American University, and a law degree from Georgetown University. His practice includes business law and nonprofit and museum law, and he has served on numerous nonprofit boards, including the New England Museum Association. Mark has also served as legal counsel to the Berkshire Museum in connection with its recent deaccessioning and sale.
So, Mark, what's your first impression of the statement?
My first impression is that it really doesn't make much of a difference in a practical sense. AAMD specifically says that it's changing. It's not changing its principles. It's just withholding sanctions. And sanctions don't matter to museums that are trying to survive. We know that from Delaware, Berkshire, and others. But I think it makes a big difference philosophically. The rules of AAM and AAMD around the use of proceeds were fixed, firm, and inflexible. No prisoners taken, no exceptions. And for a number of years, and in light of actions like Berkshire's and Delaware, there's been a question of, well, should survival of a museum be an exception? And the important ramification of what AAMD just did is to sort of validate that survival might be an exception. And if it's okay to use proceeds of deaccessioning to survive in a pandemic, then why not if the existential threat comes from somewhere else or something else? And that's a big question. And then the conversation also becomes that if we're going to have an exception, if now survival is an exception, are there other exceptions that should be appropriate? And that, again, is a very different conversation. And as we look at exceptions, we look at ranking priorities. So we weigh the duplicative, inferior painting in the basement with survival. Survival wins. What if we weigh that? Maybe 4 months ago, we might have been weighing that against paying everyone in the museum a living wage. You know, what is the higher priority there. And now it's this painting in the basement that most people would be happy to deaccession against bringing people back to the museum and getting their jobs back. So I think just by the nature of that, it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And AAMD is basically, whether you call it a slippery slope or the training's leaving the station or whatever it is, it's going to be, it's big. And I loved, if I could read it, there was a quote from an art lawyer and blogger, Don Zaretsky in Art News. And his quote was, "After this, no one should ever again be able to argue with a straight face that there is only one good use of deaccessioning proceeds. We now know with certainty that isn't the case. The AAMD itself just told us so."
Do you think that this new resolution will work as it's intended for this short period of time?
I honestly don't think it's going to have much effect one way or the other. AAMD is pretty clear that their principles still apply. They're just not going to impose any punishment. And the fact is that the punishments have been honestly meaningless, and I don't think they deter conduct, and I don't think the punishments are taken very seriously. They seem to be kind of short-sighted. Why would you punish the public by not allowing loans back and forth between museums or collaborations? Who's punished there? And in fact, they're not, I have evidence, hard evidence I can share with you later that people sort of ignore them anyway. So no, I don't think the fact that they're not going to sanction museums means anything at all. It's going to be business as usual.
Yeah, and that's another follow-up question, is how badly do AAMD sanctions hurt? And for example, with the Berkshire Museum, they've been sanctioned by AAMD. What have been the ramifications of that? Okay,
well, I think it's interesting that the actual sanction, the sanction to the Berkshire Museum, and LaSalle was sanctioned at the same time, was each of the association's 243 members refrained from lending or borrowing works of art to either the Berkshire Museum or the LaSalle University Art Museum, and to refrain from collaborating with either institution on exhibitions. And that was prefaced by saying, which affected me, ask that each of the association's members do this. When the sanctions were imposed on Randolph College and Mayer Museum 2-3 years before that, it was the same language, except that the sanctions will include instructions to our members. That's just sort of a fun fact that something happened. AAMD is intentional about its language. These are important words. And my guess is that someone explained to them about anti-boycott and antitrust legislation, and you can't go around instructing your members, of which the Berkshire Museum is not one, by the way, not to boycott other institutions. So it became a request instead of an instruction. That's just a fun fact. But within 4 months of the sanctions, a very prominent member of AAMD, a museum, requested an object from Berkshire Museum for a loan for its exhibition. So, I think these rules or requests aren't adhered to all the time. The other common prediction is, no one's going to want to lend anymore. No donor's going to want to give art to the Berkshire Museum. No donors are going to support it. And within a month or so of the controversy ending, or a couple of months, the Berkshire Museum had a request to accept a collection of art valued well into the 7 figures. And it came stipulated with, and if you need to sell these, it's okay with us. So, the Berkshire Museum is a pariah in some people's minds, but membership is up. It's stable. People, when they think about donating, they aren't donating to a failed institution. They're donating to a museum that is viable. It's stable. It's sustainable, and they're comfortable helping with its growth. So, the answer is I don't think there's been a practical effect. And we're actually involved in a study now looking at sanctions on a case study, looking at the various museums and asking what effect has it had. My guess is going to be none. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because we had talked a little bit before about direct care, which is a term that is part of the resolution that AAMD is now allowing for art institutions or member institutions to put funding toward. with deaccession funds. And one of the confusing things that I found about that resolution is that many large institutions have a definition for direct care based on AAM's guidelines that were released, or I think updated in March 2019. And it made me wonder, have there been any ramifications to institutions that have used funding in the past prior to this resolution towards direct care, or what they've defined as direct care?
Yeah, I don't think, unless, except in the cases of the museums like Berkshire and Randolph and some of the others that have gone, been totally transparent and said, here's what we're going to use the proceeds for. It's a big deaccessioning. Here's what we're going to use the proceeds for. And by the way, it is survival and not direct care. That's when they've been roundly criticized. I think AAM, it's taken a long time to come up with its white paper to define direct care. And before then, and I think AAMD kind of implicitly recognizes this, is that, and I don't know what the right metaphor is, it's a pretty big loophole, whether you can drive a truck through it or a freight train or whatever the metaphor is for this loophole. It's how do you know what it is? And unless a board, a trustee or an employee would go rogue, the fact that one museum is using the proceeds to put a new roof over a gallery that houses art, is that direct care? What if the roof covers also part of the administrative wing? You get into those issues, and I think AAM was extremely wise and thoughtful in developing the white paper, and kudos to Sally for doing it that way and her committee, to say each board needs to look at this, here's the matrix, and decide for itself. And recognizing, more importantly, that it was a board issue to decide what direct care is. That said, just for the fun of it, I took the matrix and applied what Berkshire Museum did, and you could make a case that keeping the museums alive is actually the highest form of direct care you can have.
Interesting. So with that in mind, talking a little bit about using funds now for direct care, do you think there's potential for abuse with this rule?
I think, I think there's always been potential for abuse. But the underlying assumption there is that there's something wrong with using the proceeds of deaccessioning for something other than to keep the museum alive. And I think museums that do use funds from deaccessioning for that purpose, they're not inhibited in any way by what definition direct care might otherwise mean. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it's just something to consider, because I think when you have a constant guiding professional rule, like principle for so long, to come in and say, okay, well, now this one thing that's widely accepted by other disciplines in the museum field, we're going to now accept as well. I think it's very easy for especially collections care professionals to be concerned about there becoming abuse with that change. I know a lot of university museums as well their governing bodies can have different perspectives on, what a museum collection might mean to them and the asset that it might be. And there's a lot of struggle, and there's always been a lot of conversation about universities supporting museum field ethics, and one of them being that you don't capitalize your collection, you don't sell it off to fund other programs at your university, things like that. And that's where I would be worried about the rule being a little abused, because sometimes at a higher authority or governing level, those field-based ethics or standards aren't well known. Maybe they're not accepted or adopted at a university level. That university is still your governing body, and that's where I am sometimes worried about the abuse coming through.
Yeah, and I guess one of my concerns, you're calling it abuse. and there's a lot of judgment involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
It is behavior that's inconsistent with this professional standard. And we talked about not getting into, is it a good standard or a bad standard? But boards of trustees are, and you are correct in identifying a real difference between a university or any kind of parent organization and a freestanding museum. And that's why so many of the cases actually involve university museums, because that board looks at it and says, what resources do we have that we're applying to education of our students? That's our mission, is education, not preserving objects. And when you take, I think University of Iowa has a Jackson Pollock that, I maybe don't quote me, well, too late. I think it's a $30 or $40 million painting. And in fairness, I think the trustees of University of Iowa would look at that and say, gee, if we had $30 or $40 million, is that the best educational resource we could buy with it? And that's what boards of trustees do. So this is not legal. There's nothing legal about these practices and rules. And their genesis is suspect to begin with, as we can talk about if you want. But it's just, what are the resources of this organization? How are we going to deploy them? And what's the highest priority is staying alive and sustaining our mission, not preserving a singular object. So I'm not sure it's abuse. It may be we've decided that this guideline or this practice is irrelevant. I'm still not comfortable. I'm answering your question.
No, it's good. And it's more of a conversation, because what we're hoping to do is just bring information and perspectives to this resolution so that colleagues out there, institutions out there, have a stronger understanding as to how this will affect them and can affect them for the next 2 years, for as long as this resolution is in place. And I think that's actually a nice segue into, can we go back from here? We're now at this point, like you said, it took a pandemic to bring us here, but can we go back? Will we be able to go back? Will it maybe not be as scary as we've assumed this change might be, but maybe beneficial?
You mean the change in what AAMD has done? Yeah, and again, they haven't changed anything. They've just suspended some sanctions, but it's opened up the conversation. And there's the question you ask is a really good one, because there's something else going on concurrently with this that is, I think, very much related and may actually cause a different answer to your question than if this wasn't going on. And that is the whole issue around layoffs and furloughs and what the museum world is going to look like for so many museum professionals who have lost their jobs. Before this all happened, there was a lot of discussion around systemic undercompensation, salary inequities, and there are those, including me and some other people, mostly who are involved in academic institutions or legal institutions, that say, let's look at deploying resources. And if there is salary inequity or systemic undercompensation, are there resources that can be applied to solve those problems? And somebody like Michael O'Hare who wrote an essay, it was Museums Can Change, Will They? Looks in the basement and says, here's some stuff, here's some piece of works that are being kept, will never be shown, will never be exhibited anymore. And what could they be used? How could they be redeployed, monetized, for lack of a better word, to solve some problems? And they can be. But now it's, a lot of museum professionals felt, oh no, our job is to preserve all of those things. Now the really hard question for the field will be, at what personal price, at what price to us as individuals and as a field are we preserving those? Is it, this doesn't apply to all museums, is it keeping us from being rehired? Is it keeping, 4 months ago we would have said, is it keeping us from being paid fairly, a living wage, or salary inequity adjusted? Because we have to keep that thing in the basement where we could deploy the value to solve these problems in the field. It's going to be much more urgent to say, all right, can we get people rehired? Can we kickstart this by saying, okay, maybe we can deaccession some of the stuff that's in the basement because it's never going to be shown. It costs, the normal rules of deaccessioning, what's appropriate for deaccessioning. Let's apply it and then take the proceeds to fix this compensation issue. Or in our case now, to bring back all of these people who deserve these jobs. So I think if the individuals in the field will put down the Kool-Aid long enough to think about what's the effect of retaining all of these things as to my career, the answer might be different.
It's a really interesting perspective and something to definitely consider in light of the resolution and as we go forward trying to climb out of it.
Right. And the resolution, as I say, doesn't affect very much at all, but it's this huge opening to have a sustained discussion. And it's an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe there are some exceptions to this. I just, if I may, I just wanted to read you one thing that as preparing for today, I found a letter to the Berkshire Eagle, letter to the editor of the Berkshire Eagle, that was signed by Lori Fogarty, who was then the president of AAMD, and Laura Lott, who then and is now, as you know, whatever she is, the CEO of AAM. And it was talking, of course, about the Berkshire Museum. This is the local newspaper for the Berkshire Museum. And there's one paragraph that says, even during the Great Depression, American cities and American people believed that great culture institutions made a city great. They believed in the enduring principle that the museum is there to save the collection. The collection is not there to save the museum. And I think it's kind of ironic that in putting this letter together in 2017, they reference it even in this situation where there was a Great Depression. And now we have what may be a Great Depression, but certainly a societal and economic situation that rivals it. Even in those situations, there is no deviation from the rule. And it's now 2020, and at least one of these organizations is saying, well, maybe there is. And I, in writing this, I don't think they had a clue that there might be another one. They were saying, well, see, even when things are bad, we stick with this. And now it's when things are bad, maybe we don't stick with this anymore.
What was it that you were mentioning earlier when we were chatting, that ethics and principles are tested in the worst of times, or something to that effect? Like, until we are faced with the problem itself and a reality of it, it's hard to put our ethics or principles to task. And that they may not uphold. It's kind of a
platitude that I don't know that I could recall right now. But the point was that, there is that principle that ethics are kind of easy when things are good, when there are no challenges to them. And ethics are a little bit harder, and they're really put to the test when the decisions are more difficult. And I think, and one of the things AAM did when it put this rule into effect in the early 1990s was to stick it in the silo of ethics. AAMD keeps it as a principle.
Right.
AAM could have said this is a matter of it is actually relating to accounting principles. It's a matter of bookkeeping. It's a matter of how do we report our assets. But we're going to stick it in the ethical in the code of ethics. We're going to put it there. So that's why I challenge these organizations. If you're going to call these things ethics, then shouldn't they really apply even when it's hard?
Right.
But you're not. You're kind of saying, yeah, they really are ethics. But gee, that sure is hard to go by them now because museums might fail. So then are they really ethics, or were they just guidelines or recommendations? But to cloak them in this aura of ethics, and then when things get bad, say, okay, but we're not going to enforce them anymore. Seems hypocritical to me.
Surely. That's fascinating. And I think that's actually a really good way to end the conversation here and let the people take it and do with it what they will. Thank you so much for your time and insight, Mark. It's been invaluable.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Go ahead and resume the recording.
Say, and that's a good question.
So I'll pose the question to you then. How is what's happening now comparable to what happened with the Berkshire Museum?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a fascinating comparison, because if this conversation we're having now is leading to a point where, in a situation where museum survival is at risk because of the pandemic, then the rules might be different. We might accept behavior now that we would not, wish were the case before. And that is the epitome of a slippery slope, or not. And saying, okay, well then, how does that apply to Berkshire and to Delaware Museum of Art and those who have done the same thing, where they said there are conditions that exist in our world, in our community, that are going to cause the demise of this institution. Therefore, it's necessary for us to use the proceeds from deaccessioning to stay alive. Those conditions might be, in the case of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Berkshire County, declining enrollment, a declining demographic, social needs, a big loss in the industrial base, a loss of traditional support for the museum, competition with world-class organizations in the area like MASMOCA and the Clark, and this is just a regional museum. Then the question becomes, well, wait a second, who are we to judge the causes for existential threat? You know, in the case of a pandemic, it's okay to sell something and use the proceeds to stay alive. But in another case, we're going to say, no, that's not okay. So I think museum associations are going to be hard-pressed if this conversation continues to say, we'll be the judge of why you're dying. You know, and if you're dying from this, then you can save yourself. If you're dying from that, you can't. And I think that is just nonsensical. You know, I mean, who makes those decisions, those calls?
I'm John Robinette. Today I'm joined with Stephen Schindler and Katie Wilson-Milne from the Art Law podcast, and also from the law firm of Schindler, Cohen, and Hochman. They're both partners there. I asked them to join us today to discuss the recent statement put out by the Association of Art Museum Directors, AAMD, on their loosening of the restrictions on accepting donations and using them for things other than bettering the collections. And so now their idea is that they're not going to be putting any further restrictions or punitive actions towards members who are, if I can say this properly, who will be using donor funds for these actions. So with us to discuss it is the Art Law podcast here. And I was drawn to them simply because they, not only because of their legal angle, but because they've covered this issue before for the Berkshire Museum. You'll recall starting in 2017, 2018, the Berkshire Museum launched into a large deaccession program in order to fund the museum and their operating procedures because they had fallen on extremely hard times. And that deaccession program included selling some of their major works, generating over, I think, $15 million in revenue. So first off, I want to start out by asking about that. What is your impression of the statement that AAMD released? And also, is it comparable to what happened at the Berkshire Museum?
So the statement that AAMD released is interesting in that it signals to the art community that this is a very special time and that AAMD is not being as strict as it normally is in its view of deaccessioning or use of certain pots of funding. But it doesn't actually change anything. So what the AAMD is saying now is that certain otherwise restricted funds can be used for operating expenses. So endowment funds, not the principal, but the interest on the endowment funds that might otherwise and often is restricted to non-operating uses can now be used without sanction by the AAMD for operating expenses and salaries and things like that. There are two other changes in that regard. One is that pots of restricted donor funds or philanthropic giving that may have been given in a restricted nature, the AAMD will no longer sanction museums if they use the principal or interest on those gifts for operating expenses. And the third is the AAMD will no longer sanction its member institutions, its museums, for the use of interest that might accrue on the principal from the deaccession works. So a museum, as they often do, will deaccession a work, and under existing AAMD guidelines, that's fine if it's done according to institutional policies that are set in place and is only used to purchase additional works for the collection following certain guidelines. Now the AAMD is saying you can sell a work, and if you invest the proceeds from that sale, you can use the income on that investment now to support operating expenses. So, one question Steve and I had were, in this climate, we're not quite sure what kind of investment income any institution is going to be getting from investing the proceeds of sales. So I don't know how useful that is, but it is a shift. And then aside from those three areas in terms of the use of otherwise restricted funds for operating expenses, the AAMD is now saying, look, our policy that we're not changing says you can't use funds from deaccessioning other than to purchase new works. But we will not sanction you until April 2022 if you now use the proceeds of those funds, so not just the interest, but also the principal, if you use it for care of collections. So that's a slight loosening of the AAMD's very, very strict rule previously. Now, other institutions and organizations have long argued that those kind of restrictions should allow for use of deaccessioning funds for care of collections, not just the purchase of new works. And in fact, that is the law in New York State, which is one of the only states that has an actual legislative limitation on the use of funds from deaccessioned works. But the AAMD has been stricter. So those are the areas that the AAMD has made statements about. It's not that the AAMD is allowing it or they have any power to. It's just that they're not going to punish its members for doing those things until April 2020. Sorry, right. April 2022.
I think that's really a key point here is that, the AAMD is, of course, a voluntary organization. And what it says has an impact on their members and on museums generally. But all of the things that they're commenting on are governed in most cases either by contracts, by donor instruments, and in some cases the law. And so the fact that they're now saying that they won't sanction for some of these types of activities does not at all mean that museums are free to do so.
Right. So, for example, two helpful examples. One is a museum's own endowment might be restricted in terms of how its principal is usually never supposed to be used, but how its principal and interest can be used by the museum's own internal policies. And unless those internal policies were changed, usually by an act of the board, the institution would be violating its own governing documents if it were to go ahead and use those proceeds differently. The other is if a donor makes a restricted gift, and the only way a gift is restricted is if there's some gift instrument that the museum and the donor agrees to and signs that says these funds will only be used in a certain way. The museum is not free just because the AAMD says it's not going to punish it to go break that contract. So there's still a legally operative document there that unless the donor agrees to the change, could be a legal problem. Now, I think what the AAMD is doing is trying to signal to donors that they should be very receptive to those types of requests.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but couldn't internally an institution just draw up their own doctrine and say, we define direct care as such? And, in the AAMD statement, they refer to the AAM direct care policy for how to use, as a guideline to create these policies. And it's very much driven by ethics. But couldn't you just draw up your internal policy to reflect, your own definition of direct care, receive donor funds, use them within your own definition, and not get sanctioned by AAMD? In other words, the Berkshire Museum, for example, was very explicit about breaking with that policy, and therefore they got sanctioned by AAMD. But couldn't that actually happen to the contrary?
Well, I think the Berkshire Museum example it's a good one, but it's also it's strikingly different than anything contemplated here. I mean, I think the Berkshire Museum, they made a decision somewhat not transparently right. to sell off the heart of their collection in order to embark on an entirely new kind of operation to build a science museum. And part of the problem was that they were using the principle of deaccessioning a major part of its collection to go into an entirely new line of work. And I think that was, I don't think there's anything in this statement or in the definition of direct care that would envelop or contemplate a situation like this. I think you're right, which is that direct care is, the definition of that is left, to policy making at each museum. But I don't think that goes beyond the sort of traditional care and maintenance of a collection. It certainly doesn't entitle a museum to go and spend it on operations in general.
Yeah, and recall that in the Berkshire Museum example, the AAMD normal rules do not allow for care of collections use or direct care use of funds from deaccessioned works. It's really restricted, and this is not true for all ethical organizations or member organizations like this. But the AAMD rules are you can only use it to buy new stuff and in really limited circumstances. So at that time, the AAMD had not loosened these sanctions rules. They had not said it's okay to use the proceeds from the sale of collections on direct care. That was not the case during the Berkshire Museum controversy. But I totally agree with Steve. I don't think it would have been different because that was such a unique circumstance. Right. And the Berkshire Museum was really doing many things in a non-transparent manner that caused the opposition it received.
Now, do you see any longer-term ramifications from this, even though this has a very finite and very specific end date? Now that they've opened this door, what are some possible long-term results?
I'm sure Steve and I both have thoughts on this. I think this is a great question because I think it anticipates something that was actually happening long before the coronavirus shutdown. The landscape of most museums in the United States has changed drastically over the last 100 or so years. So we have some mega museums in big cities like San Francisco, LA, and New York, to some extent Boston, to some extent, Philadelphia, Cleveland. But for many museums, like the Berkshire Museum, or the Delaware Museum of Art, their funding landscape has really changed, and they have very few assets. They don't have $1 billion endowment, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That's not the exact number, but it's a large endowment.
I think theirs is $3 billion. I just heard Dan Weiss on a podcast talking about it.
Which is a lot, right? It's a lot of money. That's more than most universities. So the AAMD statement that we've been talking about really benefits the very biggest museums that have endowment funds, that have a lot of restricted gifts and ongoing support. And it doesn't do much to help these smaller museums that were already struggling. And they're cash poor. They have a lot of assets, often donations that were given a long time ago when their geographic location was wealthier. And they're faced with what they think is a choice. And I think, is understandably feels like a choice between selling off some of these assets, which could be quite lucrative, or going out of business because they have no other funding. And that problem, I think, is exacerbated by the current situation, by the current shutdown. So it's not that it's new, but I do think we're going to see more pressure to change guidelines like these, and more debate about whether it really makes sense to forbid under all circumstances liquidating parts of collections to stay open.
Right. And I think it also, it presses the ethical question, right? Because you see these enormous layoffs now in museums. MoMA PS1 laid off 70% of its staff. And so, the question that people will also be asking is, what do we preference here? People or some of the sort of things and relics of our collection? And I think to build on what Katie said, it sort of, and this is a little bit of what happened at Berkshire, even though they handled it, I think, poorly, is there are these real tensions that exist in operating a museum today, employing people and trying to pay them fairly, and these collections that have been growing over the years and require, tremendous. So these are really important questions, and I think it seems to me that what the AAMD was doing was just giving their members a little bit of some, flexibility, as I said, or wiggle room to understand that this is a very difficult time, and we're going to take that into account. And of course, not everybody in the world cares about what the AAMD says and about their rules. I think it tends to resonate a little bit more with with a kind of somewhat more I don't know if you want to call it elite crowd, but not everybody in the communities served by these museums is as sympathetic to the AAMD ethical principles as others.
Yeah, well, it seems that, and even amongst my colleagues, I just want to be clear, there's no real consensus. There's some that say ethics are ethics, and if we throw them out for these purposes, although they are well intended, they cease to be ethics. And when you look at these statements and the original statements surrounding it, both with AAMD, they're very clear. Financial hard times shouldn't matter. Now, of course, there's no end in sight for these financial hard times right now. So, but I wanted to ask if you think that there's any room for abuse within these this loosening of the restrictions.
I think it's unlikely, because I think, again, these are not legal rules. These are totally voluntary membership codes of conduct. The AAMD seems to be worried about that, because in their statement, they specifically say this is not an invitation to deaccession work, so please don't do that. I'm not sure. I think this could develop, and we'll see. But my instinct now is that the deaccessioning that's going to occur now is going to occur whether the AAMD issued a statement about this or not. I think what it really signals is that even within the AAMD, which has been, as I said, the strictest, and sort of unwilling to compromise about this principle of the use of deaccession funds from deaccessioning, that this circumstance is the thing that is causing, even within that entity, some questioning of that bright line rule because of the exigency of the circumstances. And like you said, I think there's no end in sight to that. And the choice between, for some museums, selling a painting that's been in storage for decades and that no one looks at, and keeping a couple jobs, is a really hard one. And it's hard to explain, to the audience.
Right.
I think it also presumes a robust market that doesn't really exist at this very moment. Obviously when the Berkshire Museum was auctioning off their collection, they were in a different kind of art environment and could command better prices, even though they weren't able to sell everything that they were trying to sell. And now we've got, a very difficult auction market, a difficult selling market, and then not a lot of places to put the proceeds of those funds to generate income that's going to be meaningful. So I think that puts maybe a little bit of a brake on the notion that there could be room for abuse. I mean, that, and I think the legal strictures governing, restricted funds, I think will still be there.
I think there's also a PR side to this too. Now that they've done this, many museums may not do it just from, fear of repercussions from the public. And likewise, if, as you say, who's going to buy these things? And, it's probably either a private collector, but, a big museum who just furloughed 70% of their staff can't be seen as going out and buying, works that were release by another institution because of the loosening of these restrictions. So that's perhaps another point of view. My last question is, how badly, in fact, do you think these AAMD sanctions actually hurt an institution? I mean, is it worth even worrying about?
Well, look, we've seen examples of institutions that have been willing to thumb their nose at them. And once they make that decision, they understand what the consequences are. You can't borrow works, you can't participate in traveling exhibitions and the like, and you're probably going to be barred from some cocktail parties. But I think the reality is, I think major museums will try to stay within the guidelines as they did before. But for sort of more outlying situations, I could see a scenario where a smaller museum just decides, it's not the most important thing in the world.
Right.
Yeah, and to your question before, maybe there is a world in which more and more smaller museums do take these actions and decide that they're not in the AAMD universe, and that's not going to be a principle they follow with respect to deaccessioning, at least. And maybe that will make other organizations more comfortable with doing the same. There's a big difference between a world where no one's doing it and when there's more and more examples of it happening and being justified, at least internally.
Right. And you have seen in the past number of years prominent museum directors, pushing back a little bit on the strictness of some of these rules, just because the reality is these sort of burgeoning collections that have accumulated over the years, and the cost of maintaining them, and just saying, hey, there's got to be some flexibility in these rules, otherwise, we're not going to be able to prosper. And so I think that already those seeds are already sown, and maybe this will just be another kind of progression in that.
Well, certainly when I read the AAM guidelines for how to define direct care, you realize that is a term that has been debated since they first put something out in the early 90s, and nobody seems to be able to agree on it. And that term is front and center of this debate. So, I mean, to your point, this is not going to be settled even with this statement or after the fact. So, I think we're going to see, AAMD having to confront it pretty significantly. So, any final thoughts about this, or anything else you'd like to add?
I guess just, one additional point, which I think is a parallel consideration. It's not exactly the same, is, museums struggle because people don't want to give. They're not allowed to use certain parts of their own funding and their own cash assets on operating expenses. So that's a problem. But they also suffer increasingly from the parallel problem that donors, philanthropists, don't want to give for operating expenses. So, the Met, which looks like it couldn't possibly need more donations, you think about the big donations that it's gotten. It's to build new wings, to build fountains, to, build facilities. It's not to pay the janitors and pay the electricity bill. And, so there's also some reconsideration that needs to happen, I think, on the philanthropic side in terms of why people give and what they're, whether it's because they're getting something out of it, which is almost always the case, at least in large amounts, or whether philanthropy needs to really be re-envisioned as sort of supporting an institution from the ground up, which would be paying for things like keeping the lights on, repairs, salaries, and stuff like that. So maybe this moment will cause a rethinking of those priorities too. Yeah,
let's hope so. Well, unless there's any further comments, I really appreciate your time and your expertise on the subject. And please, everyone following along, look up the Art Law Podcast. It's available where all other podcasts are available. And with that, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Katie. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again to Sally Yerkovich, Mark Gold, Stephen Schindler, and Katie Wilson-Milne of the Art Law Podcast for lending their time and expertise to the subject. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And also, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, so that you get notifications whenever a new video comes out. Thanks again, and until next time.
Go wash your hands.